Welcome to Four Seasons Counseling. My name is Sonia Gandhi, and I'm a narcissistic abuse specialist and a survivor of narcissistic abuse.
Hi, I'm Anita Morar, and I'm also a narcissistic abuse specialist.
Let's start by talking about boundaries and what they actually are. Think of boundaries as the basic framework for healthy relationships, kind of like our personal rules for how we connect with others. They guide how we interact with the world, setting limits that make us feel safe and respected. Boundaries are simply guidelines that we create to let people know what feels okay for us and what doesn't. They're our way of saying, this is how I feel, this is how I need to be treated. They also help us figure out how we'll handle things when someone crosses these lines. Our boundaries set us apart from others and show who we really are. And if you're feeling like, I don't really know who I am, then you're not alone. That's a normal feeling. And in fact, exploring your boundaries is one of the best ways to start figuring that out. Plus, learning what feels right for you is a powerful step towards breaking out of unhealthy relationship patterns and building a life that feels more authentic and fulfilling. Talking about boundaries naturally leads us to the topic of identity because the two are so closely connected. Boundaries help us understand who we are, and in turn, knowing who we are makes it easier to set boundaries. Our identity includes everything that makes us unique: our body, our feelings, our personal belongings, our responsibilities, and even those things that don't belong to us. These qualities come to light through the boundaries we set, the space we choose to keep between ourselves and others, both physically and emotionally. Boundaries let people know how we want to be treated, spoken to, and respected. Just as importantly, they remind us how to treat, speak to, and respect ourselves. In this way, setting boundaries is a powerful way to start building and understanding our own identity.
Boundaries aren't just the hard no's. They're also the maybes, the yeses, with limits like, I'll do that later, or I'm not sure if I want to attend that event. Let me see how I'm feeling later today. Boundaries can also change over time, across situations, and vary in different relationships. There isn't a recipe to follow. It's about our gut and what feels right, based on what else is going on in our world and what works for us. If this was so simple, we wouldn't be having these conversations. If we don't have boundaries, we're as malleable as bubble gum. And if we're malleable, we are controllable. Boundaries help us feel safe and secure in a world that is usually anything but. When we grow up in a chaotic, neglectful, or toxic environment, boundary formation can often get interrupted and prevented, especially in our relationships. Now, this interruption likely also stalled the formation of our identity and individuality as we were controlled, manipulated, and not supported as children. If boundaries are a foundation and you realize that your foundation needs some work, putting in some support beams now may help change patterns from continuing in hurtful relationships. Many of us are afraid that expressing our boundaries will push people away, make people do things they don't want to, but generally the opposite is true. We have choices, and so do others. When we do not set and maintain boundaries, we end up resentful and withdrawn from relationships, and that is what leads to a relationship's eventual breakdown. So where do we start? Positive, healthy boundaries are different for each person, and there is no one-size-fits-all to manage them. We can look at ourselves and start conversations that we haven't had before, and this has the power to make changes in our lives. This is self-changing work.
Boundaries are physical, emotional, time-related, and behavioral, which define many of our values. They can be rigid, balanced, or loose. Healthy boundaries often fall somewhere in between, and this involves learning to show compassion and kindness to ourselves, which is crucial in setting healthy boundaries for ourselves. So, we will get into what healthy boundaries are and those that are unhealthy. Our goal in this journey, of course, is to move towards healthier boundaries, as we've not had the opportunity or we've been prevented from creating our boundaries. We have respected other people's boundaries, but we have allowed our boundaries to be infringed upon, to please or to maintain a relationship where the other person needed to have more control. Ultimately, this meant a breach of our boundaries. Now, some of us would say, well, I don't have any boundaries. I would argue that we all have boundaries, but those who feel they didn't have any boundaries were at the end of the spectrum or extremely loose boundaries. So growing up within a family system, some of us were taught not to question others and not to challenge other people's decisions, like me. Also, us saying no was not even an option. If we did say no, we risked punishment, disapproval, devaluing responses, and/or severing that connection with the parent or caregiver whom we are striving to have a positive, intimate connection with. We were and are ultimately wanting unconditional love and believe that allowing others to have control will lead to that. We still have an instinctual need to attach to our primary caregivers, so we adjust to our environment. Many of the clients that we have worked with have said that they didn't feel they had their own identity or didn't know who they were. They didn't know what they wanted or what they needed. So, with the lack of trust in ourselves, we often look outside of ourselves to others to define who we are. And that often includes the lack of boundaries as we try to be flexible. And we feel that if we set boundaries, then we are being selfish and we feel guilty. The questions are, how do we create boundaries? How do we begin to form our identity and manage that guilt as we start to focus on ourselves rather than the people around us? Setting boundaries becomes a challenge because we have held ourselves responsible in toxic relationships, or we were blamed for everything. We know narcissistic personalities can never take responsibility for anything that they've done, even in the face of evidence. And at times, when we've tried to hold them accountable, it was turned back onto us, and we were made to feel a variety of things such as worthlessness, unattractive, stupid, and especially crazy. Healthy boundaries are a crucial component to self-care and self-respect. It makes sense that if you don't have healthy boundaries, it can lead to many challenges such as burnout, anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, and ultimately the feeling of distress. In other words, a lack of healthy boundaries can negatively affect all aspects of our life. The benefits of having healthy boundaries include communicating your needs in a relationship, making time and space for positive interactions, and setting limits in a relationship in a way that is healthy for us rather than for everyone else. And it may mean that we can start to address anxiety, depression, and exhaustion. I visualize boundary setting as the food that we start to eat, which makes us feel more energized. This is nourishment for our soul, which has been crying out for attention.
Autonomy is so important in terms of our self-care. At work, if we're constantly saying yes to all the different tasks that we are being asked to complete, it puts us in a state of overwhelm and may not help us get the work done anyway. That can lead to dissatisfaction and resentment, where we resent our superior. And we may also resent ourselves for saying yes all the time. That attacks our self-identity to the core. When we talk about this in relationships, we spend our time doing things for our partner, our children, our extended family, our friends, which leaves little to no time for us to take care of ourselves physically, mentally, and emotionally. But that drive is so strong to please others. It is overwhelmingly strong. And so our self-talk says that we shouldn't be upset. We should want to do for others because of that great need to be seen by those we are doing for. Ultimately, given our trauma, the coping strategies we've developed is to please others, which we in turn believe we will get filled up and it will be enough. But it's never enough, is it? If it did fill us up by making others happy, then why are we struggling? Why do we feel such pain? Why do we feel so empty and exhausted? So clearly, constantly giving and not receiving from others has become lonely. We don't often ask for anything. We don't ask for anything for ourselves, and we don't verbalize what we need. And others don't seem to be offering to do something for us. The moral of the story is that we must look after ourselves to feel better about ourselves in all aspects of our lives. Ultimately, we are responsible for ourselves and this time in our lives. Once we can take care of ourselves, we will know what to ask of others so that we can also be taken care in a healthy, balanced way, rather than be dependency or externalizing.
The big question is, how do we do that? So maybe it's helpful to start with some examples of what healthy boundaries are. I want you to check in with yourself as I go through a few little examples. I want you to take a note of your reaction or the feelings in your gut as I share these examples. And I ask this because I want you to continue the practice of tuning into yourself and what your body is really telling you. I know I spent most of my life ignoring or silencing what was coming up inside of me because it would bring on feelings of guilt and shame, which I couldn't bear. The first example is that your partner demands that you turn out the lights and come to bed because they want to go to sleep, but you have a big report to finish for the big meeting the next day. Check in with yourself and take note. The second example is you ask your partner to look after your 1-year-old so that you can get dinner ready, and your partner says, no. What emotion pops up for you? Be honest. We don't often ask for our needs to be met. What can happen, and likely what you have experienced, is feelings of guilt. But the other feelings that we often ignore also is the feeling of resentment and anger. Resentment deep down inside is that you shouldn't have to ask for help when others should just know that you need help and offer it. But if we muster up the courage to ask for help and we are met with an unhelpful response rather than feeling angry or upset with the person, we internalize it. And here comes that guilt. And our internal critic starts to say how selfish we were for asking. Does that sound familiar? There are 7 types of personal boundaries that we will consider. And don't worry, I'm not suggesting that you start implementing all of them. It just gives you some scope to think about which ones may be small steps in these areas that are easier to take than others. Small steps, small changes. So the first is physical boundaries. Those involve touching others or others touching you. The second is property boundaries. This deals with the things that we own or lay claim to. For example, our homes, clothing, and other items. Third is the sexual boundaries. These include the physical and emotional aspects of sex as well as acceptable language, jokes, and offensive comments. Next is emotional relational boundaries. We respect these boundaries through how we care for others and by letting them have their own emotional experiences, but they're also about not taking responsibility for other people's emotions. The next is intellectual boundaries. These are about our thoughts, our beliefs, our ideas, and how they are respected. Next is spiritual boundaries. These are about our belief systems, how we practice them, and what we choose to share around these beliefs. And lastly, time boundaries. These are boundaries regarding one of our most precious resources, the expenditure of our minutes, our hours, and our days. Some of these categories can overlap. As I've reviewed some of the literature, the advice that is provided is simply to say no firmly to something that you don't want to do. Now, I know my reaction to that, and that is, I can't just say no. That was me up to about 3 years ago, and a lot of work has gone into me finding a way to say no without using the word no. I call it finding a way to lovingly say no. But that's my strategy or style. As we start moving through how to set healthy boundaries, you'll find a way that is the most comfortable for you and will honor your growing comfort with setting these boundaries. Some of the clients I've worked with have tested out saying no or setting a boundary in whatever way that they could manage. Much to their surprise, they were met with acceptance and respect. The other advice that's given around setting boundaries is not to over-explain your rationale for saying no. I know, that's a hard one. And I know for many of us who have experienced emotional abuse, we felt a strong urge to explain and over-explain and justify anything and everything. But as we know and have experienced, explaining and over-explaining are not met with any kind of positive reaction from a narcissist. And a narcissist revels in putting us down with every word that we provide as an explanation or excuse. Those words are often then turned against us like a weapon. Now, I know this may sound uncomfortable or even scary. Not to worry, one step at a time. I always say less is more. I know for me, I couldn't start testing out boundary setting with the person that was most emotionally abusive towards me, which was my father. So I started with work colleagues, acquaintances, and then some of my friends before I could even entertain the thought of setting boundaries with my father. But each person's journey is individual. And we'll just provide some of the tools here so that you can decide how and where you would like to start in testing out and setting boundaries. The first step I would suggest is to check in with yourself when something arises that you need to decide about. Let's pick something less threatening, like a parent committee that has asked that you make 200 cookies for a fundraiser event the next day. Now, our default is going right into people pleasing and saying, of course. But I'd be lying if I didn't say my inner voice or something inside of me said, oh my God, I can't make 200 cupcakes by myself, especially for tomorrow. Again, we often silence that voice because we want to please others and don't want to let people down. And we don't even consider what the other person is asking of us as being unreasonable or taking advantage of us. We don't want them to think that we're not capable of doing it. And guess what? We may be incapable of doing it, but we are worried about what people think of us, and we want them to like us and think that we are dependable. So we agree. We want so desperately to be accepted, acknowledged, and appreciated because those are the things that we have lacked in our significant relationships with narcissists.
Let's tune into that voice and turn up the volume. That voice said, oh, no way. The first obstacle or barriers to hear what our gut is saying. Acknowledge it. And then, of course, that conversation in our head begins around one voice saying, absolutely, I'll do it. I can't let them down. And the other voice that's probably very softly saying, I can't do it and I don't want to. That battle leads to us feeling crappy about ourselves. Our inner critic jumps up and down and says, you have to do it. Are you crazy for thinking that you shouldn't do it? And underneath is that very strong feeling of fear that you will be disliked, judged, criticized, or worse, rejected. Now, this conversation probably happens subconsciously, but we want to bring it to the consciousness so that we can begin to alter that conversation bit by bit. Once we can hear the negative voice, we can start to combat it logically and rationally. And I say that because when we start to feel anxiety, guilt, and shame that we have been programmed to feel, we're not thinking logically and rationally. We go into fight or flight, where panic sets in if we decide to renege on something that's promised, or the critic inside of us makes us feel selfish because we don't want to do it. And then being able to have that conversation on a more conscious level where we can reason with ourselves. I know the critical voice in my head was someone else's voice. I could have heard their dismay or their disgust. Calling me selfish or lazy was a big one. So strange and hurtful to me when it was never my intention to be those things that he accused me of or people accusing me of. But then, of course, I was gaslighted. Somehow I thought I was lazy or that I was stupid. As you can see, all of these things stack up on each other and we're left often in confusion, self-doubt, and a lack of confidence.
What I had to do was to change the voice inside my head to be the voice of somebody who is close to me, like a friend or a family member. What would my friends say when I felt guilty for saying no to something or someone? Usually, they would tell me that it was all right to say no, that I have a right to decide on something that I don't want to do. So that's the voice that I used to use to combat my inner critic. My friend would say, if she was asked to make 200 cupcakes, I know she would have said, no way. My voice wasn't strong enough at first. So I needed the strength and support of a person who cared about me and who always said that I was being too nice to people or that others were taking advantage of me. Who would that person be for you? Step 2 would then be, how do I begin to believe that third-party voice who is being very logical and very concrete around the reasons why whatever is being asked of me is undoable, unmanageable, and possibly unfair? And this might be where journaling can come in handy. I've often told my clients to do a pro and con list around, for example, those 200 cupcakes. The pros would be, of course, that I would gain recognition, acknowledgement, and appreciation. All of the things that I was aiming for and searching for. Some of the other pros would be raising a lot of money with 200 cupcakes to sell, and I'm sure there are so many others that we can think of. Now, let's think about the con list. The amount of time that it would take literally through the night, because of course we want the cupcakes to be fresh. Another con would be how tiring it would be, especially if I had to do it by myself. This is of course the issue around time boundaries. And I know me, I would have been criticizing myself for doing something I didn't want to do in the first place. So self-loathing would come into play for me. We want to try and get away from self-loathing or critical thinking about ourselves, first and foremost. We want to create self-respect. I suggest you write it out so you can become conscious of factual information and not be governed by strictly those emotional needs and our survival instincts. we need to bring facts into our decision making. That gets us out into our head and out of fight or flight mode, where we aren't thinking or making decisions out of guilt and people pleasing, which are our defaults. And the last step, we want to decide and decipher through what kind of boundaries we want to begin to create or resurrect. There are a few categories when we talk about boundaries, such as them being rigid, permeable, or flexible. So let's go ahead and outline those here.
Rigid boundaries are boundaries that nothing gets through ever, and there is zero space for negotiation. Some boundaries should be rigid. For example, I don't want a stranger coming up and touching me. I used to have acquaintances touch my stomach when I was pregnant. Although I felt uncomfortable, I used to allow it because I didn't want to be seen as rigid or whatever I thought I was going to be perceived as by the other person if I said no. So I allowed my space to be invaded. On one level, this sounds innocuous enough. But if this is our subconscious thinking of others touching us, we have likely let others touch us in different contexts, not realizing we could say no. Just something to consider as we move forward. We have a right to say no. Permeable boundaries are ones that everything gets through if it wants to. These boundaries come into play for us when we don't know how to hold our ground. So for example, I respond to emails pretty much 7 days a week with my clients. That changed over time as I realized that it was depleting my energy and sending a contradictory message to the client. So this encouraged me to create healthy boundaries. Sometimes having permeable boundaries allowed others to walk all over me. And other times, a permeable boundary can exist without issues. Flexible boundaries are the middle ground boundaries that we should operate for most of our boundary situations. Flexible boundaries are the ones that come from listening to the internal voice that wants to protect us and wants to experience growth. That's the voice that makes continuous adjustments so that we are willing to compromise in certain areas. It may lead to the betterment of the relationship and emotional growth for yourself. And at other times, it becomes a protective measure for ourselves, especially depending on the circumstances or who's asking for that matter.
Some boundaries should be rigid if they defend real safety and security. They are the boundaries that reflect our needs. These are often ones that apply to everyone, such as being touched inappropriately. Now, I recognize that many of us have allowed others to invade our personal space because we didn't want to be criticized, judged, or to be called rude. Now, some boundaries may be rigid for one person and not for the other. Our boundaries also change in different relationships, different circumstances, and different points in our lives. Many of our boundaries are likely too permeable, which is quite common. The problem is that sometimes we don't know how to exercise that control. So we need to learn to firm up our boundaries, but that takes some testing out. Thinking of the 3 bears, where the character tried out the bed that was too hard, then the bed that was too soft, and then the perfect compromise between the two with the baby bear's bed. Existing boundaries can also be a response to past experiences and should also consider how we may overreact for boundaries that were once permeable and now are rigid. So, for example, refusing to go on a date with anyone after being in a narcissistic relationship because of the fear of repeating patterns. That's too rigid. We are the product of our experiences, and if we had painful experiences in the past, it entirely makes sense to overcorrect to protect ourselves in the present and the future. Overly rigid boundaries may provide us with a sense of safety and security in the short term because they help insulate us from situations that scare us. But that isn't the point of boundaries. Boundaries are designed to provide a safe passage through life, not as a tool for controlling every environment we are in and every person that we interact with. So why is consent so important when we are thinking of boundary violations? I've defined boundaries as the line that differentiates us from others. Boundary violations or breaches can happen when we don't know what our boundaries are, and therefore we can't communicate them to others. So what can happen is, without intention, actions can lead to us being left feeling unsafe or disrespected. So consent plays such a big part in how we are treated and ultimately respected. But how do we express our boundaries when we aren't sure what they are for us? So let's define consent. It's the informed permission given that is voluntary or an agreement reached between two people or more regarding an activity. Boundary violations occur when there is action without consent. Boundary violations can be external and internal. External boundary violations are when people do something to you in a physical way, like touching you without permission or taking your things without you agreeing. These are tangible and measurable. The second is an internal boundary violation, when a person violates our emotional space and tries to get us to change our behavior and actions to suit their needs. So gaslighting and manipulative tactics are examples here. These boundary violations take the form of coercive control. And this is the area that narcissists are very good at breaching. And this is exactly the area we want to strengthen. This is probably a good place to stop so we can take some time to consider where your boundaries are for various events and people, as well as your safety. This is the starting point of reclaiming and shaping the healing journey. Take some time to also begin practicing small boundary changes. Often, the ones that only involve us can be a great place to start. So, for example, as I mentioned earlier, an easy one for me was that I wasn't going to answer phone calls from my clients after 6 p.m. That was my time, my downtime after a long day. This one doesn't usually upset people, so it was a great one to feel in control of my work life and create some of that balance. As you are reinforced, often internally, you start to feel a little more confident to try out something else. As I usually say, the world did not end because I didn't answer my phone after 6 p.m. We'll be right back with part 2. Triggers and trauma responses. Let's look at what goes on in the brain when it perceives a threat when faced with having to set a boundary with someone closer to us for fear of anger, rejection, or abandonment, which is in the extreme. We need to revisit the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses, which is our threat system, or the sympathetic nervous system is activated. The fight is attacking before I get attacked. The flight is to run because we're not feeling safe. Freeze is don't move and don't respond at all, hoping maybe the threat will go away. And lastly, fawn is let me people please so that I can be seen as an ally rather than an enemy. This response system is critical to our survival. This whole process is an emergency broadcast system. The front part of our brain, called the prefrontal cortex, is thinking logical part of our brain. It takes in some of the outside information, which could be a boundary violation, like someone is coming at us, yelling and waving their arms. The prefrontal cortex goes into high alert, and the boundary violation in the present moment can be activating a trauma response from past events, which is the trigger. The amygdala flips through the index of previous similar experiences And if it is similar to something that didn't go well or hurt us, our prefrontal cortex activates the response that it thinks will be the fastest way to achieve safety. We don't want to get hurt again, so it activates one of the appropriate responses for self-preservation. We want to get to our parasympathetic nervous system to kick in so that our calmer state of logical thinking and safety is present. When the 4F system gets out of hand and the amygdala is on high alert all of the time and reacts to things that aren't actual threats, that's the trauma response. Our brain needs to learn how to calm itself down so it just responds to actual threats again. This is where boundaries can be frightening to try and set, but also where they can be very helpful. For now, let's talk more about how our amygdala regulates our boundaries. Because we are learning to trust ourselves again, we need to listen to our bodies. We've had a lot of practice suppressing our internal system because we have been conditioned to respond in a certain way. Tuning into our bodies in our day-to-day interactions is the best way to determine if there is a boundary that we want to honor, as well as determine if there's a boundary violation. Our subconscious mind is tuning into incoming information than our conscious mind is. Our reflex system, or the subconscious level, kicks in within 1/10 of a second of confronting something that's coming in, like a boundary violation, which doesn't even get processed on a conscious level. This is an inward feeling from the body telling the mind what to do instead of the mind making the decision and telling the body what to do. But our gut reactions are real, literal things. This impacts our whole body. So we may feel tearful, have a racing heart, chills, and difficulty breathing, which are our fear responses. Paying attention to our gut may save your life and can save you some heartache. So let's use an example. A look that triggers fear. I have experienced that when my father would just give me that look. Likely from his inner rage, which was now being directed at me for some little thing that I had said or done or not done. Suddenly I would freeze and I knew what was coming. But rather than walk away as my body was telling me, I was conditioned to stand there and take his abusive words, and automatically tears would be rolling down my face. Now, had I walked away, I may not have incurred the same level of pain, but the trigger of the look still caused fear. Now, keeping in mind that I was young, so I was highly vulnerable and wasn't able to keep myself safe back then. Today, if my father gives me that look, my body has the same internal fear response, but I've also gotten better at looking away and walking away. The fear is still programmed in me, but now I push my prefrontal cortex, or the active thinking part of my brain, to take over quickly, and my boundary kicks in. The boundary that says, nope, I will not stand around and be rated by anyone. Is that easy? Nope. But I have been reprogramming myself consciously for a while so that my fear is met with me protecting myself rather than expecting anyone from protecting me. I'm building trust in myself. So let's break it down a little bit further. The first thing is that I am now consciously telling myself, calm down and breathe, so it gives my brain a minute to come back online and not go into fight or flight. Once I do that, I remember that I am not in any physical danger and I'm safe. The look was not safe when I was 7 or 8, so my logic has to kick in and my adult voice has to say, you're an adult and you don't have to stand and take this from him. By me taking back control of how I see and experience the look, it gives me control over it and ultimately control over my responses. In that situation, it was to walk away. That was what my gut was telling me to do. Now, there were times when my gut said, say something to him. There were times I said something back to my father. But as you all know, trying to argue or even reason with a narcissist is futile. But that's not why I was saying it. I knew that there was no miraculous turnaround, that he would have backed down. I was saying something for myself. I was teaching myself that I could say no to the look and not back down. That gave me a sense of control. In the past, that look completely unraveled me. The trigger is still there. Scientifically, we know that our body stores these memories and these triggers. But once I recognize the trigger, I go through a few steps consciously, which is different from when I was 7 or 8. Let's review them. Recognize that I am being triggered. Often we don't know what's going on, just that our heart is beating quickly, we're sweating, our pupils are dilating. So our sympathetic nervous system is kicking in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. I would breathe and I would try and get my thinking, logical brain back online, saying something to myself like, I'm safe, as I scan my environment. So I want my parasympathetic nervous system to come back online. That's our rest and digest calm mode. Decide which action my gut is telling me to do based on the risk in the environment. And then take that action. So either say something or leave the situation. This allows me to have a sense of control and very much focused on my actions rather than the other person's response. As empaths, we are so focused on others' reactions and responses, and then we usually would want to people please or fawn them to control our environment and that threat. This time we are doing something different. Acknowledge that it felt good to take some control. And this one is really important. Why? Unconsciously, we have this fear and it plays on repeat. But consciously, we want the message to the awakened self that we battled our unconscious belief or assumption that we are never safe when the stimulus shows up. When we learn new things and repeat them over and over again, we are starting to create new neural pathways to combat the triggers that are embedded in our brains. We spend a lot of time putting ourselves down, feeling weak and sometimes helpless. But when we are starting to feel brave, in control, and protecting ourselves from the control of others, we need to honor ourselves for taking steps in the direction of caring for ourselves. And therein lies the work of achieving self-worth and self-love. Well, this rounds out our mini course on boundaries. Stay tuned as there's going to be some amazing new mini courses coming out. And please join my YouTube channel. That's where you're going to get a lot more information on narcissism, but not just narcissism. There's a lot of information on the internet about narcissism, and there's a lot of books. The part that's really difficult is the self-worth, self-esteem, self-confidence, and the self period. That's a different journey, and that is one that you can access support, whether it's through friends, whether it's through family, or whether it's through a therapist. I hope you'll reach out. If you are needing some support, please subscribe to my channel, which is 4 Seasons Counseling, and take care.